we're not discussing something very abstract. We're talking about real people here. And the real people we are talking about are the comfort women. Who are they? Take a look at this. They are those forced into sex slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II. The statues that likely to be built in California, sitting on a wooden chair. The young girl has her fists balled in her lap, her expression unsmiling and determined. Her heels unattached to the ground, and on her shoulder sits a small bird. There's an empty chair beside her. Everything about this statue has some meanings behind it. We will not go into further discussion about what this art piece means, but rather, what does it remind us and how history should be looked at. Mr. Yi, you're joining us from California. Certainly this is a big debate going on over there, to have it or not to have it, listening to the Japanese lobbies or not. What is your take of the final result?
I have a couple of thoughts on this agreement, on this issue, Tan Wei. First one is, I believe the 2015 agreement, I think there's a lot of controversy and discussion. At the same time, I do think the agreement will hold, because as of now, we have about 34 out of 46 survivors, harmonies, have accepted the money, the funds, and so it would be very difficult for the government to take the money away, to take the compensation away from the survivors and give it back to the government. So as of now, a majority, 34 out of 46, have accepted the compensation. This is in
Mr.
addition
Yi, if
to
you could look at the camera,
women.
it would be perfect.
Yes.
If you could look at the camera and talk to us, it would be perfect. Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
sure.
I heard your first point,
time.
and your second point would be?
Sure. Oh, and my second point is that I believe the Comfort Woman statue represents this larger internal discussion that is being held in many different countries, including Japan and South Korea. So in South Korea, there's a in a way, the Comfort Woman, for me, the Comfort Woman controversy is not between it's not just between Korea and Japan. It's between different schools of thought within Japan and different schools of thought within Korea. And so I'm not an expert on Japan, but let me talk about public discourse in South Korea.
Briefly, if you can.
So historically, yes. So the dominant paradigm is that the comfort women were girls who were kidnapped, forced into the Japanese army, in slavery conditions. More recently, with books coming out from Sarah So and Park Yu-ha, there's been kind of different perspectives, different viewpoints, and they're raising the question that there were comfort stations in the Japanese army. There were also comfort stations in the American army in Korea after the Korean War. There are also comfort stations used by the Korean
army. So your point is, Mr. Yi, if you could briefly help us understand your views. Your views here.
Oh,
please.
okay. So I'm saying that there's the Comfort Woman statue represents this larger internal debate in Korea as to what actually happened.
Okay, Mr. Piehler, let me ask you to invite you into the conversation so that we would also feature your opinion as well. Mr. Yi certainly has been talking about, quote unquote, a traditional debate. It is not new at all as to what the history was like. And also, he's also talking about whether monetary compensation, once being paid, would mean that some of the political agreements about what the facts were, even though different administrations seem to have different views, would become a reality. I want to go to you, Mr. Piehler, about this. One is, does money say everything? Secondly is, if history is debated, if history is ever debated, does it mean that there is not a history that we should respect? I want to go to you with these two questions, Mr. Piehler, to react.
Well, let me take the history part, and I think one of the decisive things that happens in World War II, and I think it was one of the hallmarks of the Tokyo War Crimes trial, was that they clearly thought sexual assault of women, rape, sexual slavery was a war crime. And it's a struggle we still, that enforcing of that international law that was very soundly established in Tokyo and subsequent treaties is a real hard thing to follow and enforce and ensure that civilian women are not sexually abused in wartime by soldiers. And in terms of Japan and the question of the comfort women, I think the scholarship is pretty sound that in wartime many armies did in fact try to enlist prostitutes, and that's not unique to Japan. The question is the question of force and compulsion. And while there's a scale to this, it's pretty clearly established by the Tokyo trials that there was in fact enslavement of women, that it wasn't just economic incentives, but that there was a much greater issue of coercion. Money certainly matters, and I think it particularly matters, I think it is for elderly women who've had a very traumatic life, and I think this is one of the reasons why many of them, I can't speak from specific knowledge, but it does not surprise me that some comfort women did in fact accept the money. But I think the larger issue is really a question of I think, not the Japanese people, because the Japanese people are very divided over this, and in fact many Japanese are well aware of this. Many Japanese historians have talked about the issue of comfort women. It's really an issue of their current government, really coming to grips with this issue of Japanese culpability in World War II.
It is no secret, Mr. Yi, that Japan has been tempting, particularly the governments over the past few decades, to provide their versions of the history of the Second World War. As we remember, it was the one who was defeated. As we also remember, it was the one who invaded most of the countries involved in the Second World War in the Pacific theater. So the question is, does it mean another version of history appears in someone's book, in somebody's rhetoric, in certain government's argument, necessarily equals to history is different? Mr. Yi. Mr. Yi? We are having some problems, I guess, over there, talking to Mr. Yi. I'm sorry about that, because those are interesting questions. I still want to have his answers. But Mr. Piehler, I have to go to you, but certainly you are an expert about the Second World War history. The 2015 document between South Korea and Japanese government, it was reached under very special political circumstances. And certainly the president, which was driving that agreement, is now under huge political pressure. And many of her decisions now being questioned as to under what circumstances those decisions were made and made by whom. I'm having a very long question, but this is very important. Therefore, how much do you think when it comes to these kind of agreements, can it, in a way, be able to answer to the questions of those comfort women involved during the Second World War?
Let me just give a little maybe historical background on this and these types of agreements. And what I find interesting about this agreement, it's very reminiscent of what Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of Germany, did in the 1950s. Instead of compensating Holocaust victims directly, he made reparation payments to the State of Israel, even though Israel did not have diplomatic relations with Germany. Though I think to the credit of particularly the Federal Republic of Germany, by the 1980s and 90s, they were directly compensating victims of the Holocaust, and particularly compensating German citizens who were victims of Nazi war crimes and other crimes. And I think one of the issues is the question of apology, but I think rather than, and I think it's a good thing actually that state-to-state diplomacy took place on this issue, but I think what a lot of critics of Japan would like was sort of Japan really having a better reckoning with the actual victims of sexual slavery.
Right. At this point, Professor Piehler, we see not only South Korea, but also in Australia, in the United States, in China, some of the other countries, whether directly involved or not, all have these comfort women statues. How much do you think this would really help people to understand history? Or this would still continue to be a very controversial issue, particularly when you have the older generation of comfort women passed by already?
Yeah, and I would just add to the comfort women stations you've mentioned, there's one in Palisades Park, New Jersey, just outside of New York City, that was dedicated several years ago. You know, how effective are statues for remembering history? We have an awful lot of Spanish-American war monuments that no one has any idea what they are. So statues alone are not necessarily the best vessel of memory. And I think one of my jobs as a historian, and particularly as the World War II generation is sadly passing into oblivion, in many ways, particularly the good people in World War II. Our job as historians is really to talk about the issues that are important, and particularly issues involving the sort of ethical and legal and moral conduct of combatants. And I think one of the reasons to remember the comfort women is, in a sense, to really deal with an ongoing issue in war, is the continuing sexual assault and rape of women in war.